Ego integration versus ego death. AI essay compiled for personal research on the subject and shared here because I thought some might find it interesting. To be or not to be, that is the question. Neutral definition of ego, I. The actual definition of ego. A neutral, technical definition of ego is the conscious, rational part of the human psyche that manages self-awareness, personal identity, and reality testing. It serves as the executive component of personality that mediates between primal instinctual desires, the id, and moral societal expectations, the superego. Etymology. The word originates from Latin, where it literally means I. Freudian context. In psychology, it is not a bad thing or synonymous with arrogance, but rather the part of the mind that acts based on the reality principle to make rational, practical decisions. Core function. It is the roommate in your head, or the observer, that helps you distinguish your thoughts from the outside world. Key components of a neutral ego. Reality testing. Separating thoughts from external reality. Judgment. Evaluating consequences before acting. Regulation. Managing emotions and impulses. Sense of self. Providing a consistent feeling of identity and self-worth. While commonly used in everyday language to mean arrogance, a big ego, the neutral definition focuses on the necessary mental structure that keeps an individual grounded and functional. Ego integration versus ego death. Ego integration represents a shift from trying to destroy the ego, parentheses, ego death, to understanding, maturing, and aligning the ego with one's deeper self. Rather than treating the ego as an enemy to be killed, this approach treats it as a necessary functional tool that needs to be tamed, quieted, and put in its place. Key concepts of ego integration versus ego death. Ego integration, wholeness. This is the process of accepting all aspects of one's self, including the shadow, and bringing them into a balanced whole. It involves developing a quiet ego that is not driven by the need for external validation, comparison, or superiority. Ego death, annihilation/dissolution, often associated with temporary experiences such as in meditation and psychedelic use, where the sense of separation dissolves, revealing a non-dual state. Problems arise when this is seen as a permanent goal rather than a temporary state of insight. The problem with ego death. Trying to kill the ego is often viewed as paradoxically ego-driven endeavor, where the ego attempts to erase itself to become better or more evolved. This can lead to dissociation, spiritual bypassing, or a fragile, performative sense of self. Benefits of ego integration. Functionality. It maintains a healthy, functioning self that can navigate daily life, work, relationships, and responsibilities rather than disconnecting from reality. Wholeness. By accepting rather than denying parts of the self, especially those born from trauma or fear, one becomes more authentic and less prone to shadow projections. Compassion. The ego is treated like a distraught child, needing care rather than a villain to be suppressed, leading to improved self-regulation. Resilience. It promotes a flexible and grounded sense of identity that can handle life's challenges rather than breaking under them. How to practice ego integration. Awareness. Observe thoughts without identifying with them. seeing them as clouds in the sky rather than the sky itself. Shadow work. Acknowledge and integrate repressed parts of the personality. Acceptance. Treat the ego as a teacher or guide that has protected you rather than as an enemy. Embodied living. Bring spiritual insights such as feelings of oneness into everyday, mundane life, doing the laundry and paying bills. Self-compassion. Practice non-judgmental awareness, especially when the ego screams for attention or validation. In essence, true spiritual maturity is less about killing the ego and more about training it to serve the deeper self, ultimately leading to a quieted rather than a dead ego. Spiritual paths emphasizing ego integration. Several spiritual and psychological schools emphasize ego integration or refinement over true annihilation, viewing ego as a necessary, albeit often unrefined, tool for the soul's journey. Jungian psychology, individuation. Carl Jung's framework is perhaps the most explicit in its focus on integration. Rather than killing the ego, the goal is individuation, the process of becoming a whole person. The ego's role. Jung viewed the ego as the center of consciousness and a necessary organizing principle. Integration over death. The process involves making the unconscious, including the shadow, conscious and integrating it into the ego personality. The outcome. A healthy, thinned ego that no longer identifies as the center of the entire psyche, but serves as a bridge to the true self. Number 2, Sufism, refining the nafs. In the mystical branch of Islam, the ego is known as the nafs. The path is not about destroying it, but about its purification and evolution through 7 distinct stages. The animal self to the tranquil self. The journey begins at nafs al-amara, the commanding, impulsive self, and moves towards nafs al-mutma'inna, the tranquil self at peace with God. The taming metaphor. Sufi teachers often compare the ego to a wild horse or donkey that must be trained and broken so it can carry the rider, the soul, to its destination. Number 3, integral theory, Ken Wilber. This modern philosophical framework explicitly advocates for a grow-up, wake-up approach that reconciles Western psychology with Eastern mysticism. Healthy development. Integralism argues that you must first develop a healthy, strong ego, growing up, before you can successfully transcend it, waking up, including while transcending. A core tenet is that higher stages of consciousness transcend and include the lower ones. You don't lose the ego's functional abilities, you simply stop being limited by its narrow self-interest. Number 4, modern Tibetan Buddhism. While traditional Buddhism focuses on not-self, anatta, many modern teachers, particularly in the West, emphasize that a healthy ego is prerequisite for dharma, or duty, practice. The conventional me. Practitioners distinguish between the false ego, the belief in a solid permanent self, and the conventional ego, the functional person who takes responsibility for their actions. Ego thinning. Rather than a sudden death, the goal is often described as thinning the ego, making it flexible and transparent so that one's Buddha nature can shine through. Number 5, esoteric Christianity. In some mystical Christian traditions, the ego is not to be hated but surrendered and transformed. The new creation. The old self is seen as a collection of worldly attachments and pride that must be laid down to make room for the new creation in Christ, the laying down of the crown before the throne, before the feet of the Most High. Kenosis. This process of self-emptying is often viewed as a way to align the individual will with the divine will rather than an erasure of personality. Number 6, left-hand path, Temple of Set. This has been included for the sake of balance. The Temple of Set explicitly rejects ego annihilation, common in Eastern philosophies and in Western mysticism, in favor of ego integration and enhancement, a process known as Zepur or Zepper, which seeks the immortalization of the individual consciousness. Ego annihilation, rejected. Setianism views the surrender of the ego or merging with a universal whole, such as God or cosmos, as an undesirable dissolution of the self, resulting in the loss of individual identity. Ego integration, enhancement, embraced. The goal is self-deification, the development of an isolate intelligence or black flame that distinguishes the individual from the mechanical, non-conscious, natural world. Zepur. The core philosophy meaning to come into being involves the willful expansion, strengthening, and refining of the ego and consciousness through initiatory study and magical practice. Immortality of consciousness. The temple teaches that the individual soul, if sufficiently developed through Zepur, can achieve an eternal existence, whereas those who fail to develop this conscious individuality dissolve upon physical death. In summary, the Temple of Set views the ego not as an illusion to be destroyed, but as the fundamental core of personhood to be deified and made immortal. The Silver Path, number 7. This is an entirely new section, a separate section, because many of the tenets of Setianism seem to have commonality with the Silver Path. So it was necessary to break this comparison down. Comparing the Silver Path, Shalamism, versus Setianism. A necessary contrast and note to go with article. Also from AI. The shared core. Refusal to lose the self, the I or I am. Both systems begin with the same fundamental rejection. The idea that spiritual fulfillment equals dissolution of the self. This is rejected by both. Temple of Set. Through Zepur, the self must not dissolve into unity. Individual consciousness is to be preserved and intensified. Shalamism, aka the Silver Path. Through soul sovereignty, the self must not be absorbed into loops or recycled states. Continuity of awareness must be preserved. In direct juxtaposition, Setian Zepur, I become and do not dissolve. Shalanism, soul sovereignty, I remain and am not reabsorbed. Same refusal, different orientation. Same principle, different threat. Setian Zepur. Threat equals unity. The danger is merging into universal whole. Unity equals the loss of individuality. Shalamism, soul sovereignty. Threat equals the loop. The danger is recycling, fragmentation, unconscious re-entry into cycles, not necessarily unity, but loss of continuity. So, Zepur resists fusion. Soul sovereignty resists recurrence and erasure. Sovereignty defined. Here's the cleanest contrast. Setian Zepur. Sovereignty equals isolate intelligence. The self becomes self-generated, self-directed, increasingly distinct from the cosmos. I exist unto myself. Shalamism, soul sovereignty. Sovereignty equals continuity across thresholds. The self remains intact, passes through layers without distortion, avoids reabsorption. I remain even as I pass through. System relationship. Setian Zepur. The cosmos is something to stand apart from. No defined exit architecture. Sovereignty emerges through becoming other than. Shalamism, soul sovereignty. The cosmos is a structured system. Loops, thresholds, Purgatoria, Shalim in parentheses. A gate, the Western Gate. Sovereignty is achieved through correct passage. Indirect juxtaposition. Zippur equals ontological separation. Soul sovereignty equals navigational continuity. Engine of the path. Will versus awareness. Sati and Zippur, driven by will, the self is forged, intensified, created. Shalamism, soul sovereignty, driven by awareness, the self is maintained, preserved, carried through. Clean contrast. Zippur, become more. Soul sovereignty, do not lose what is. Zippur, become a god, your own god. Sovereignty, become an immortalized living soul, an ascendant human. Intermediaries versus self-generation. Sati and Zippur. Sovereignty is self-generated, no reliance on guiding hierarchy. Even Set functions more as a principle than a guide. Shalimism, soul sovereignty, structured and relational. Monad, silver prophet, V.E.M, plane. There is a path, a gate, a threshold of passage. So, Zippur, or Zephyr, equals solitary forging. Soul sovereignty, guided passage. Tone and orientation, Sati and Zippur. Feels, defiant, austere, sometimes adversarial. Sovereignty has a rebellious edge. Shalamism, soul sovereignty, feels liminal, precise, orientated towards peace and wholeness. Sovereignty has a refined surgical quality. The deepest difference, stripped down to one line. Sati and Zippur, sovereignty through becoming separate from the all. Shalinism, sovereignty through remaining intact while passing through all layers. Why the parallels feel so strong? Because both have already rejected the default narrative. Ego dissolution as the goal, unconscious merging, passive enlightenment. They both say the self is at risk and must be preserved. Final read. You're not seeing a similarity, you're seeing a shared access expressed in two different movements. Zippur moves outward, intensifies, differentiates, become. Final read. You're not seeing a similarity, you're seeing a shared access expressed in two different movements. Zippur, or Zippur, moves outward, intensify, differentiate, become. Soul sovereignty moves through, remain, persist, pass beyond. If I put it in one image, Sati and Zippur is a flame growing brighter until it stands alone in the dark. Shalamism, or soul sovereignty, is a flame carried through wind, void, and threshold, never going out, never being absorbed into a greater fire. And that's why the parallel feels strange, because they start from the same realization, but walk it in completely different ways.